Kelly Finnell is a sought-after speaker and leading expert on employee stock ownership plans. He has spoken at more than 300 conferences and meetings throughout the U.S., London, and Sydney, and he's a published author on using ESOPs in succession planning. A trusted resource to business owners and exit planners, Kelly is the author of the ESOP Coach, Using ESOPs in Ownership Succession Planning, and the president of the Memphis-based Executive Financial Services. Kelly graduated magna cum laude from the University of Memphis and from its law school. Kelly, welcome to the podcast.
Corey, thanks. Great to be with you.
Yeah. So listen, you are, I guess, what some of us call a reform lawyer, right?
Oh, exactly. Right.
I'm 38 years in, and apparently I can't be reformed. But in any case, I want to, before we get into all that around ESOPs and that, option for exit monetization for business owners, I want to take you back to when you were a little kid growing up, 8, 10, 12 years old. Where did you want to be? Because, my guess is an ESOP expert wasn't it, and maybe even a lawyer wasn't it. I don't know, but you tell me.
Well, I can't believe you asked that question. You're going to be surprised by the answer, probably.
Okay.
I wanted to be a Catholic priest.
Okay.
I was in the last class of altar boys in 1962 that learned to say the Mass in Latin. And I did not give up on that dream until after my first year of college, which was spent in a Benedictine monastery.
Wow.
So I've not been asked that question in years about what I wanted to do when I was 12. And so thanks for asking it, because that's still a good memory and kind of an interesting, fun part of my life.
I love that. It's a question I've been asking for other podcasts for hundreds of episodes. I always love that insight into folks. And it's, first of all, it's one or two people have surprised me where they actually wanted to be at 8, 10, 12 years old, what they're doing now. But that's a handful out of hundreds. So it's always interesting to see what we thought we were going to do and how things evolve.
Yeah, it took a very drastic turn.
I love it. One other question looking back, what was your first deal of any type that you were involved in? It could have been something small when you were younger. Maybe it was early in your legal career. I don't know, but you tell me, what first deal of any type?
It was for a relatively small company. The owner had a couple of value realizing events and was set financially and wanted to make sure that this company that he loved and the employees who he loved got the business after he packed up and moved to Florida. And so it was a small, simple deal that I did very early in my career that fortunately turned out great.
Love it. So let's talk a little bit about your journey and how you got into the ESOP space. So, what did you have a law practice where you were doing more general stuff and came across it? Could you hop right into ESOPs? Give us a little bit more about how you got in this space.
Well, after I gave up on the thought of being a priest, I wanted to be Perry Mason. I wanted to go to law school to be a litigator. And after my first year of law school, I had the opportunity to go to Massachusetts from Memphis and work for the legal department of an insurance company in their pension division.
Okay.
This was the summer of 1981. No, I'm sorry. This was the summer of 1979.
Okay.
So at that point, ERISA, the law that codified ESOPs, was only 5 years old.
Yes.
And this group of very seasoned, experienced pension lawyers got a letter, it's way before email, so a letter in an envelope delivered by the U.S. Postal Service asking for them to prepare a white paper on ESOPs. And all of these guys looked around at each other and they all said, I don't know anything about ESOPs. We'll assign this project to the kid. In the summer of 1979, I was the kid, and I spent much of the summer researching and writing about ESOPs. So that diverted my second dream of being a litigator and focusing on business law. And so I went back to law school with absolutely no business background from my undergraduate experience and took all of the business courses I could in law school and then got involved in the retirement plan business as soon as I graduated. And so back then, this was before 401k plans came into law. So we were doing benefit plans and money purchase profit sharing plans. And in 1984, when Section 1042 was added to the code, that was a section that allowed owners of closely held companies to sell their stock to an ESOP and defer the tax on the gain from that sale. And that was a big boom to ESOPs for closely held companies. Prior to that, most of the companies that had done ESOPs were banks and publicly traded companies. And so in 1984, I began my experience with ESOPs, and that just accelerated over the decades.
Wow. It's funny you mentioned ERISA, and I remember I started, I graduated in 85, but even, during my second summer, so that would have been in 84, I worked at a firm and that, similar to many people, the sort of my version of your version, at least the last turn of it was when I graduated law school, I, for some reason, thought I wanted to be a management side labor law attorney. When I went to the top national firm in the country for that and ended up hating it mainly because in between my second summer and my permanent, a job start after law school, they brought in a new partner to head that department who totally ruined it. He was a horrible human being, and it was a great culture before he came, whatever. And I ended up moving over to corporate securities and never looked back. But I remember, it was funny you mentioned, it brought back a memory, because back in the day when there was always this fight on, this is more ERISA generally, than particularly ESOPs, but there was always this fight between the tax people and the labor people on actually not who wanted to do the ERISA, but who didn't want it. Like the labor people was like, no, that's tax stuff. You guys handle that. The tax people were like, no, you got, like, nobody wanted to go near, except for, there was occasionally this one person who was smart enough to say, I'm going to become the ERISA expert on this new thing. And then they became very valuable, but most people were running from it.
Yeah, and I think still do. And ESOPs are even a subspecialty within the specialty of ERISA. Right? It's a very niche business, and one of the challenges with ESOPs is a lack of knowledge. And so, one of my goals in life is to spread the word about what a great planning strategy an ESOP can be.
You see, now you just took yourself back because you're evangelizing just about something else now, right? So,
Good point. You're exactly right. Gospel of ESOPs.
I love it. So let me ask a very, what is, I'm sure, a basic question, but I think most of it, listen, even as an attorney, I don't do any ESOP work, but I certainly have we do a lot of M&A and a lot of exit and a lot of succession planning and a lot of that kind of stuff. And many of my clients do, or some at least, raise the, or they've looked into, or they ask the possibility of ESOPs. And I've heard different views, if you're under 10 million, or if you're under 20 million, or, it doesn't, but, what are the fundamental guidelines on, not only in terms of size, although that's a thing, where it makes sense, whether that's from cost point of view or complication point of view, or the other factors about the employees, you need to have, but what are the fundamental basics on what kind of companies are appropriate for or should consider ESOP as one of the potential succession or exit vehicles?
Let's start with the financial metrics, and then we'll talk about the owner's planning goals. So in terms of financial metrics, I think ESOPs work best for companies that have adjusted EBITDA of at least $2 million.
Okay.
And so we're talking about, small but not micro-sized companies.
Yes.
Over the last 3 years, our average client had adjusted EBITDA of $4 million. And we've done ESOPs for companies that had adjusted EBITDA as little as 1.2. And then during that period, the largest one that we did was for a company that had 56 million of EBITDA. So that's a broad range, but the heart of the ESOP market is probably where our average client has been over the last 3 years. Companies with about 4 million of adjusted EBITDA and typically around 100 employees.
Okay.
In terms of the owner's planning goals, if a business owner says that the key to our success is company culture, then we know that that company is a great candidate for an ESOP. And many of our clients are service businesses, engineering firms, architectural firms, advertising and PR agencies, where their main asset is their people. And a wise business owner knows that no matter what a third-party purchaser tells them about, after the transaction, nothing's going to change, a wise business owner realizes that that's one of the biggest lies in the world. Once they own you, they control you, and their culture is going to become your culture. And that's going to impact your employees and, importantly, your clients and customers.
Yes.
And so for business owners that are looking to maintain that company culture, an ESOP is a great opportunity. When a business owner says that they want to protect their employees and make sure that there are no or at least minimal job displacements after a transaction, an ESOP is a great option. For owners that would like for their employees to be able to purchase the company, but deal with the age old problem of them not having the money or the credit to be able to do that, then an ESOP provides a way for the company, for the employees to own the company without having to pay for it themselves because the company finances the ESOP transaction in which the employees become the owners.
Yeah. So much I want to delve into. So I love the comments you made, and certainly as somebody who does a lot of external, M&A transactions with external buyers, it's one of the things I tell my clients all the time. Listen, they can promise you all you want that they're going to maintain your culture and your employees. The biggest thing you can do is in due diligence is to try to assure that their culture, their existing culture is aligned with your existing culture. Because if it is, then okay, because like you said, their culture is going to dominate it. So the question is not like if their culture is not aligned and they've made promises to you, all right, yeah, biggest lie, so the only way you have any assurance that your culture, quote unquote, is going to survive is if their culture is very consistent. And so it's not that your culture survived, it's that their culture survived, but it's not inconsistent with your culture. So it worked, right? And that's a tough thing to find. And also, although, you are focusing rightly so, and there are definitely a lot of entrepreneurs that I so appreciate them who really do care about their employees and their legacy and that kind of stuff. Also, there's a financial benefit often because if cultures, an external sale, if cultures don't match and you end up losing people, very often you have some sort of, it could be a retention, or clawback provision and or an earnout provision that you have less chance of hitting on an external deal if you end up losing key people because they're not happy with the buyer. So there's also a financial impact to doing that wrong on an external sale. Yeah, but let's delve a little bit. Obviously, in terms of our listeners, we have some people who might have some familiarity or more familiarity with the ESOP. Some may have none at all. So, you talked about the fact that it does solve for a problem where the employees don't have to come up with the money because internal succession, right, which is maybe the bigger umbrella under which an ESOP can be considered in, can be done without an ESOP. But the biggest impediment in most industries to that is exactly that. It's that the employees just don't have the money to do it. And then they'll ask for seller financing. And then the seller's often, like, well, if I'm going to finance this thing, I run the math. Why don't I just continue to run it and maybe have the executive team run it and I'll pull back, but I'll still own it because if I'm basically the bank, why would I do that? Right. So talk to us a little bit more about that aspect of how ESOPs are funded, financed, so to speak, and how it solves that problem.
Most ESOPs are funded with three sources of capital: excess company cash, bank debt, and seller notes.
Yeah.
So let's assume that you have a $20 million transaction in a company that has $3 million of EBITDA. Then that company is probably going to be able to borrow without a personal guarantee given by the owner or by any of the employees about $6 million from a bank. So that will become cash at close. Let's assume that this company has excess cash not needed for operations of $2 million. Then at close, the owner is going to receive that $8 million and a promissory note issued by the company to be paid over time after the bank debt's paid off for $12 million. And so an ESOP is a glide path typically for a business owner to exit the company gradually. Many of our business owners tell us that their spouse married them to have dinner, but not lunch, and they're not ready to cash in and walk away. They want to stay involved. They feel the need to diversify their portfolio and to get some cash and to have an income stream. And an ESOP can give them a way to accomplish those goals while still staying involved, often less actively and more of a strategic than an operational role after the transaction.
Right. And gets to take some chips off the table. But yeah, exactly. So that's great. So there is obviously there's still most often a seller financing portion of that, but it's not the whole thing like you would have on an internal. So you at least get that cash off the table. Let's talk a little bit about like the risk factors, right? One of the issues people worry about any kind of internal sale, right, is okay. Yeah, and certainly where there's a portion of any portion or some of in the seller's notes is what happens if right, the company as a problem goes downhill, the employees don't run it right. And that's a driver sometimes for folks to do an external sale, especially in a situation where the deal terms are such where they're getting a lot of the money up front or within a short period of time. Like, for example, doing during a 1 or 2 or 3 year employment, or consulting relationship where they stay involved to help assure the transition and the money. So talk to us a little bit about that evaluation for, we have a lot of entrepreneurs who are looking at different exit strategies. Let's compare the risk factors of that versus maybe an external deal.
Let's talk about two risk factors. The first one is a lack of a strong successor management team.
Yes.
But even though I'm an ESOP consultant and that's all we do, I don't necessarily think that because I have a hammer, everything's a nail. So if you don't have a strong successor management team, you're probably not a good candidate, as you said, for an internal transition, of which an ESOP is a type of internal transition. And so without a strong successor management team, you probably should sell to a third party that has that platform management team in place.
Yeah.
So I often say that a company is a good candidate for an ESOP if it's a place where the boss comes in late, takes a long lunch, and leaves early.
Right.
He's already delegated the operational day-to-day activities to that successor management team. The other risk is just a macroeconomic risk.
Sure.
In the spring of 2008, we did 4 ESOP transactions. Then on September 15, Lehman Brothers declares bankruptcy and the Great Recession started. All 4 of those companies survived despite the fact that they had taken on big debt just a few months before the financial collapse. And they did that because of the fact that they had seller notes, which gave them flexibility to renegotiate and extend the payment period so that we didn't kill the goose that was laying the golden eggs.
Yeah.
And so the seller debt can be viewed as a negative because you're not getting all of your money up front, but it can also be viewed as a positive because you have that flexibility to work through difficult financial times because the owner is going to be the friendliest banker that the company could ever have.
Well, that's for sure. That's for sure. I love that. Okay. So are there any, you mentioned a lot of service industries, right? Which for various reasons it makes sense. Let's elaborate that a little bit more on why ESOPs are particularly good for service industries and whether, outside of that, what kind of industries more often may use ESOPs as well.
I think in service companies, ESOPs work really well because of the company culture aspect of it. If you've got an educated workforce and those people are the keys to your success, then you want to make sure that you tie them to the company. And an ESOP gives them an equity-based incentive. They become the owners of the business. And so there's no stronger tie that you could possibly offer them than for them to become owners of the business, especially if they don't have to pay for that ownership interest. Some of the other places where we see ESOPs working very well, we've done 11 ESOP transactions this year, and 4 of them have been for construction and contracting firms.
Okay.
And that is a trend not just with our firm, but nationwide in the ESOP community. We're seeing a lot of construction and contracting firms do ESOPs. We also have a lot of clients in the distribution industry. Floor covering is one of our niche markets within distribution. But we see, we have industrial supply distribution clients, consumer supply distribution clients. And so those are some of the bigger markets that we see.
Why do you think there's been this, it seems like, surge in the construction?
I think that there are a couple of reasons. The biggest probably being that private equity doesn't seem to be nearly as interested in construction and contracting firms as they are in other types of industries. That might be because of the cyclical nature of those businesses. It might be because of the bonding requirements that are, part of that industry. And so an ESOP offers a buyer where another type of buyer might not otherwise exist. And so in the panoply of buyers, you have private equity, you have strategic, you have other inside transactions. Well, if those first three are not available, then an ESOP can be a great option.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about how, so, you have a company with 100 employees, you do, or more, you do an ESOP, and now these employees become owners. Well, first of all, are all the employees owners? What are the requirements? And then how is that company managed going forward? Who has decision-making authority? How does all that work?
So the answer to the question, who's going to participate in the ESOP, is the same answer to the question, who participates in your 401k plan. So an ESOP is a form of qualified retirement plan that's required to cover substantially all of a company's employees. And so one of the points of confusion sometimes with business owners is when I tell them that the people that are eligible to participate in their 401k plan are the same people that are going to participate in the ESOP, they say, well, I've got 100 employees and only 40 of them are contributing. I'm not tired about those that are contributing. I'm talking
Eligible. Eligible.
everybody who's eligible under the eligibility rules, which generally means that they're full-time, they work at least 1,000 hours a year, and they have over a year of service with the company. And they're not independent contractors, they're not part of a bargaining unit. So those are people that generally are going to participate in the plan. And the shares that are purchased initially by the ESOP are going to be held in what's called the ESOP suspense account. So picture the ESOP trust as a box, and this box has two compartments. The top compartment is where all of the shares go when they're first purchased, and that's called the suspense account. The shares are held there and then released from suspense over a period of time, and that might be 20 to 40 years typically. So let's assume it's 20 years. So each year, 5% of the shares are going to be released from the suspense account. They're going to drop down to that second part of the box, and there they're going to be divided up among the participants' accounts on what's called a salary ratio basis. So if I have an employee who makes $300,000 a year and one who makes $50,000, that $300,000 a year employee is going to get 6 times as many shares in their account as the $50,000 a year employee. So that's how the owners or the employees become owners. The company, after the transaction, is going to be managed in much the same way that it's managed now. There is going to be a trustee of the ESOP, and that trustee is going to be very active in the implementation process through due diligence and through negotiating the terms of the transaction. After the transaction is completed, that is, the shares have been purchased by the ESOP going forward, the trustee is going to be a passive investor in the company. It's going to be a silent partner, essentially, and it's going to be dependent upon the company's board of directors to hire the officers that are going to manage the company. So the reality of it is not much changes in terms of corporate governance after the transaction has been implemented.
Yeah. So, I wanted you to bring out some of these things because, what that means, listeners, is that, I have sometimes clients who say to me, oh, I really just want to transfer this to my executive team, the ownership. Well, if you only want to transfer ownership to your executive team and you don't want your other 90 employees participating, we got to talk about something different, right?
ESOP's not the answer in that situation.
Exactly. Exactly. And there are other ways you can do internal succession outside of a qualified, the whole thing about being under ERISA with a qualified plan is that there are these anti-discrimination values, all these things that apply like you all might. And that's why the analogy to a 401k or the comparison is really good because that's something with a lot of you, are more familiar with where you can't just, put away money in a qualified plan, But your executive team, you need to do at least a certain, but your percentage ratio, whatever it is for everybody. So that's why it's a great parallel.
And in exchange for doing that and complying with these ERISA rules, you get tremendous tax advantages that you don't get with any other type of internal transaction. So the first of those tax benefits, the most prominent, is that if you have a 100% ESOP-owned S corporation, then that company's income is forever going to be free of income tax. No tax at the company level because it's an S corp. No tax at the shareholder level because your shareholder is going to be the ESOP trustee, which, like a 401k trustee, is a tax-exempt entity.
Right.
And I know that sounds crazy and too good to be true, but Public Supermarkets is the largest ESOP-owned company in the country. So this is not something that's undercover. It's not something that's questionable. It's been in the code for about 25 years now. And there are big, powerful companies like Publix, which has 300,000 employees that participate in their ESOP. And they compete very well with Kroger because Kroger pays tax and Publix doesn't.
Right.
And Publix has a much more motivated workforce because they own the company that they're working for.
Yeah.
One of the other tax benefits is that in certain situations, if you have owner who's selling C corporation stock, and if that person reinvests in a like-kind exchange, then under Section 1042 of the code,
Yep.
gain on that sale can be deferred and perhaps even forgiven if the owner holds that replacement property that it purchases until death and gets a stepped-up basis. And
So similar to what some of our real estate folks might be, or other, on a 1031 exchange, it's just somewhat equivalent, right, to that.
the exact same concept. In a 1031, you sell real estate, you invest in other real estate. In this case, you sell your stock in your company and you reinvest in the stocks or bonds of a U.S. domestic operating company, and you don't pay tax. You do get a transferred tax basis, just like you would in the real estate deal. And then the goal is to invest in such a way that you can make that deferral long-term, or perhaps even convert it to a forgiveness at death with a stepped-up basis.
Yeah, love that. So let me ask the question so there's a view, or at least a conversation in the entrepreneurial growing company world about, the difference between being an entrepreneur and an employee. And certainly when I talk to my clients about not qualified plans, not ESOPs, but, where people look to equitize or, look for some sort of, we do a lot on attraction, retention, and, and incentive vehicles, right? So things like phantom equity, things like, okay, should people get any kind of form of true equity? Is it restricted? Is it voting? Is it not voting? Is it a different class? Maybe we don't want to do equity. Should it be phantom? We do a lot of that with clients. And one of the things that we talk about and comes up, and it's, it's a legitimate conversation, is, the difference in mindset between employees and between, entrepreneurs and owners, right? And frankly, it's something I caution, my folks on. And again, it's a very different scenario when you're talking about, a handful of key execs. So you're talking about a smaller workforce, but it's like a think like an owner kind of thing, is a transition that, a lot of employees have to go through. Some can, some can't. And then also this is all outside the concept of an ESOP. One of the things I have my clients seriously consider, and I'll tell you, in most cases, I advise them only to have true equity if people are paying something for it, or else they don't value it, right? The exception I give sometimes is if you have a company where you have early employees who've taken a significantly under market salary to help grow with you and you didn't equitize them earlier. Okay, now maybe you're equitizing them to make up for that. But let's bring that conversation in here, because what you're doing here in mass, so to speak, in an ESOP is that you're turning every employee into an owner. And while in concept, and again, I can make the arguments on both sides, but you're the expert in this. I want to hear it from you. The argument is, hey, you got a bunch of these folks who really don't have an owner's mentality. People would say, especially maybe at the low levels, but even high level people. I mean, there are certain people who would never open their own company, certainly, right? And if they're not having to come out of pocket for it, how do you address the concern that maybe they don't value it? And how do you, is there any support and training, in the ESOP world around this mentality shift? And, what do you do with that employee group to have them understand their owners now?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. Of course, I'm glad you asked. Employees only appreciate something to the extent that they understand it. And ESOPs are complex and difficult to understand. So that gets back to something that I mentioned earlier about our biggest markets being service companies, engineers, architects, advertising and PR people. We've actually done several ESOPs for investment management companies. So the more educated the workforce, the easier it is to get that appreciation that you want for what this concept means for them.
Yeah.
But even in a manufacturing company or a construction company, it takes longer, but you can help the employees understand and appreciate what they have. So we do that to start with an ESOP rollout meeting. So I was in College Station, Texas a couple of weeks ago for a meeting with an electrical contracting company that we had just implemented an ESOP for. We had 300 people in the room, and we went through in very basic language what an ESOP is, how it works, how it can benefit them. And we gave them illustrations. We showed them projections of what their accounts might look like. We also promised that we would be back every year to repeat that exact same PowerPoint presentation because repetition is one of the keys to understanding. In the interim, we're going to provide the company quarterly newsletters. We're going that will just be front and back of one page and will focus on one specific small subject within the ESOP concept to help them bite this big cake in small pieces. And that combination over a period of time of consistent communication can really help the employees appreciate it. When it really sinks in is the first time one of their coworkers gets a check. So when somebody retires or has some other distributable event, they all hear Joe got $50,000
Right.
in his ESOP account, and it was more than he had in his 401k account. And that's when it really comes to life and people appreciate it. And so that might be 3 to 5 years. When I first got into the business, I naively thought that if we told the employees what we were doing at this rollout meeting, that they would all, go crazy and with excitement. And that's just not reality. It takes time and consistent effort.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it can't happen if you do those things.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad, you're honest on that because not that you wouldn't be, but, it is a process, right? And I love that because you're right. So let's talk about it. It's a perfect segue to the place I wanted to go next, which is what are these distributive event triggers and what happens if somebody leaves the company? What are the normal characteristics around equity in terms of monetization events or distribution events or in terms of what might be forfeiture events?
Yep. In any retirement plan, including an ESOP, there are 4 distributable events: death, disability, retirement, and termination of employment. With a 401k plan, when any of those events occurs, the employee might get a check for their account balance within 90 days. An ESOP is different in that with an ESOP, if you leave for one of those first 3 reasons, death, disability, or retirement, you're going to begin receiving payment of your account the year following the year that event occurred. So you retired at age 65 in 2024. You're going to get your first check in 2025, and that's going to be for 20% of the value of your account. And you're going to receive annual distributions over the next 4 years to get 100% of your account value paid to you. And that's paid to you in cash, not in company stock. And you have the ability to roll that over into an individual retirement account and defer the tax on it. If you leave for the 4th reason, termination of employment, which means that you quit or you got fired, then you have to wait 5 years So that happened in 24 again. Instead of receiving your first payment in 25, you're going to receive it in 29, and you're still going to be paid out over a 5-year period at the rate of 5% or of 20% a year, rather. And so those rules are structured like that to protect the integrity of the company's cash flow.
Yes.
And so if you didn't have those rules and you had a group of people leave all in the same year, there could be a run on the bank, which would decrease the value of the accounts of those people that stayed.
Right.
So it's easy to argue that today Congress doesn't think very rationally, but apparently at some point back in the 70s, it did. And it came up with this very logical structure on how people get paid out so that they get paid the money that they need for their retirement without ruining the financial integrity of the company.
Love it. And in terms of the termination conversation, whether it's voluntary resignation, termination with or without cause, it's the same thing.
Correct. Yeah, you can no longer have a bad boy provision in a retirement plan like you could a few decades ago. So regardless of why you were terminated, you're going to be entitled to your account value.
Got it. So let me just bring this home, and before I have you add anything about, what you see in the market or whatever, and I ask you my final two questions. So let's, sort of run a typical example, because you gave a number of factors which have brought together, creates this sort of pattern. So, you said, hey, the stock's going to be, 20 to 40 years, right? You gave that number. You gave how it, goes into the two buckets, right? And flows down. And then obviously goes out to all the different employees. And then, of course, there's all these, rules in one. So in terms of what is flow, I guess the piece that I want to delve into a little more, in terms of what is sort of flowing down each year, right? To the portion that's flowing down each year to be distributed amongst the employees. Is that just, if it's 20 years, that's 1/20th? Is that how it works?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be 5% of the shares that are in the suspense account, so 1/20th. What that means to the employees, though, is this. On average, companies allocate to 401k plans 4% of the employee's wages, so 4% of compensation. With an ESOP, on average, ESOP companies allocate 10% of employee pay.
Yeah.
So 2.5 times more gets put into their account with an ESOP as compared to a 401k plan. So an ESOP is a very generous form of retirement plan. Almost all of our clients, when we talk to them initially about the ESOP, they already have a 401k plan.
Right.
They all continue the 401k plan after the ESOP's established. About half of the companies redirect what had been the match from the 401k to the ESOP to help pay off the ESOP debt. The other half do both. They continue to make the match and do the ESOP contribution, but that's purely a choice for the company to make. The law doesn't dictate what they do there.
Got it. Okay. Before I ask you the final two questions, I know this is an open-ended question. You could probably spend hours on it, but maybe pick some highlights. Anything in terms of whether it's, trends, whether it's any anticipated regulatory, changes or opportunities that might be coming out. What is new and interesting, if anything, going forward that people might be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, first, we don't see any legislative changes on the horizon. ESOPs are one of those few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on. Bernie Sanders is one of the biggest supporters of ESOPs in Congress. And there are a lot of Republicans that support ESOPs. Republicans love ESOPs because of the tax benefits
Yeah.
that are available to owners in their companies. And Democrats love ESOPs because it is a wealth shifting device
Yes.
from the owner of the company to the employee. So there is something for everybody to love about ESOPs. So we don't see any legislative or regulatory changes on the horizon. This year was a record year for our firm, and I think for the ESOP world in general. And that is primarily the result of two things. First, the aging of the baby boomers, which we're all aware of. The baby boom business owners are looking for liquidity and succession strategies. And the other thing is an increased level of knowledge among professional advisors about ESOPs and how they work and their benefits. So I think those two things have come together to cause a real boom in the ESOP world. A few years ago, we were doing about 6 ESOPs a year, and we're almost doubling that now.
Wow. And just in terms of the way, like, I guess final question before I ask my final, my usual final two. In terms of the team that you need around you, and in terms of like budget ranges for that, well, obviously, they need an expert like you. Who else is involved? There are regular attorneys, there are accountants, other players that, and what are we talking about in terms of,
Yeah,
the cost?
ESOP are a team sport. So there are lots of professionals involved. And of course, those professionals bring with them cost. Let's talk about the buyer side of the transaction. So this is the ESOP trustee. So you're going to have a professional trustee
Yep.
that specializes in ESOP work. They've probably been doing it for decades. They have hundreds of ESOP transactions under their belt, and this is probably all that they do. They're going to engage a financial advisor, a valuation firm that is going to make sure that they don't exceed their two primary legal responsibilities, which is not to overpay for the stock that they purchase and to make sure that all the terms of the transaction are commercially reasonable. They're also going to employ their own legal counsel that's going to review and negotiate and approve all of the documents. So that's three professionals on the buyer side of the transaction. On the seller side of the transaction, they're going to have us as their ESOP consultant who's going to represent the sellers in negotiating the terms of the transaction. We're also going to source the bank financing for the transaction. They're going to have their own legal counsel, and that sometimes is a single law firm that has ERISA, ESOP, and transactional experience. Sometimes they have a transactional attorney and he will associate ERISA, ESOP counsel.
Yeah.
And so now we've got at least 3 sets of lawyers involved, not counting me and my partner, who both have law degrees and are members of the bar but don't practice. Then you're going to have the bank lender, and they're going to have their own counsel. So there are lots of professionals involved, and I think as a general rule, a company could expect a total of expense of about $500,000, which is a lot of money, but by comparison to hiring an investment banker and still having all of these other professionals involved is probably substantially less than the cost of a sale to a third party.
Yeah, love that. All right, so I lied because I'm not. I have one more question that popped into my mind that I was thinking about asking earlier, and then we moved on to something else because you raised the conversation of making sure that the valuation, right? Getting the valuation to make sure. So this is a question that I get as well is, okay, in terms of obviously every industry is different, deals industry, but in general, in terms of the comparative valuations that you get in an ESOP versus an external buyer, for example, is there a discount or a premium or are they in alignment with other alternatives, mainly an external third party sale?
Yeah, it depends on what type of external purchaser we're talking about. So, as you well know, the world is divided into financial buyers and strategic buyers. So, an ESOP can pay legally the maximum amount that any financial buyer would pay. So, when we have a client who has explored a sale to private equity and then come to us to ask about a sale to an ESOP, we have in every single case of the last 40 plus years been able to exceed the value that they were offered by private equity in the sale to an ESOP. And that's counterintuitive, but it's perfectly logical because private equity is an investor pool. It's an alternative investment. And those investors want a very high rate of return on the capital that they're investing.
Right.
Now, if you have a company that's a target for a strategic buyer, an ESOP might not be able to match that price and almost certainly would not be able to exceed it, especially in certain industries like technology. You don't see many technology companies doing ESOPs because the financial buyer or strategic buyer market rather is so robust.
Yeah, and I think most of our listeners understand that. But in general, strategics are paying more because they're not just doing a financial analysis on a monetary return, but because exactly as the name says, there are strategic benefits to them, which can help them monetize. Where the classic 1+1 = 10, because they're able to they have a market already that they're going to cross sell this new product into, or this fixes a problem for them that can help them increase. So there are benefits that are beyond the financial analysis that I mean, they come down if you're doing a discounted cash flow or a projection going forward on what that's going to bring to their bottom line. It's substantially more, but it's not just based upon financial multiples, because it is that accretive benefit on the strategy side. And that, that it makes sense that that would not be a good candidate or less of a chance it's a good candidate for an ESOP. Great.
Absolutely.
So this has been phenomenal, Kelly. Listen, so if people want to find out more about you and your firm and what you do, what's the best place for them to go?
Our website is www.execfin.com. That's EXECFIN. So we've got lots of information on there that explains who we are and what we do, and provides a lot of educational information about ESOPs. There's a piece on there called Succession Planning Guide, and I would encourage people, your listeners, to go to our website and download that. There's also a link so that they can buy my book on Amazon from that website. The book is written for business owners. There were already lots of books out there written for lawyers and investment bankers and commercial bankers and CPAs. My mission in doing the book was to write something in plain English for business owners with lots of case studies and illustrations. So they might find that helpful as well.
That's great. Kelly, my final question on the podcast is always about my highest value in life, which is freedom. And for me, that means everything from freedom around the world, from people from oppression, to why I've been an entrepreneur for decades and haven't had a boss. What does freedom mean to you, and how does it impact your life and business?
Well, I think in a very similar way, I'm the same as you. I've never had a boss. People ask me, what are my thoughts about retirement? And I tell them, why would I retire? My boss is a genius and a great guy to work for. So I just signed a new 5-year lease and plan to continue working as long as I can. And that's my idea of freedom, is to be able to play golf a couple of days a week, visit with my 7 grandchildren, my wife of 47 years, and to enjoy what I do, helping business owners realize the value of their life's work.
I love it. Kelly Finnell, thanks for being such a great guest on the DealQuest podcast.
Thanks very much, Corey.